name is Michelle Herline, and I'll be your hostess for this episode in the series Impact 100 Nashville, the Early Days. I'm a co-founder of Impact Nashville, and I was president of Impact 100 Nashville from 2018 to 2022, and continued to serve the organization as the legacy chair today. On this episode, we will discuss how and why our process and categories of grants has evolved over the years. Joining me today is Molly Locker, who put together the very first grant process and actually designed our process for us. We also have Meredith Ficken, who took over as the second grant chairperson and automated our process. And then Tiffany Corsi, who was Meredith's successor and ran the grant process for over 2 years. So Molly, we're going to start with you. Can you give us a high-level overview of how the first grant process was run and what it took to get us going with Impact 100 Nashville?
We started with truly nothing. And really, I wanted that to be something that we thought through intentionally was, again, not being duplicative in who we are funding as Impact Nashville, because that was a big goal of ours as founders of this organization, is that we wanted to really seek out where were the gaps in nonprofit funding and how could we meet them in that. And so I had met with the Center for Nonprofit Management and with the Community Foundation to really hopefully triangulate on what are they seeing, where are their issues, and who's not getting funded and why, and what does that look like? And so what we found was that there were a lot of nonprofits that were struggling to get funding in their first few years of creation, because a lot of grant funding organizations require you to at least be 3+ years in existence, even more mature than that, ideally. And so in those early years, a lot of nonprofits were struggling to even get off the ground because they couldn't get access to grant funding. And we also found that there were a lot of smaller nonprofits, so ones that don't have big names, a lot of big marketing dollars, or even, people to help get their name out there, but were doing awesome work. And they were also struggling to get that kind of notoriety. So we were really interested in that. A big thing that we were passionate about in the beginning too was that sometimes these grant funding organizations were not open to funding operational budgets. And that's hard because that can be something that's not exactly, very splashy for grant funding organizations to fund things like salaries and keeping the lights on and actually keeping some of these like very utilitarian activities going for nonprofits. And so after doing all of that research and finding that, that's where we really got passionate, and where we started was, if we are here to really make an impact, we want to make sure that we're doing something completely different than other grant funding organizations in town. And so that's how we landed on what we called the small and new category. That was really near and dear to my heart. And really that was us reaching out. It's hard to get the word out to nonprofits and let them know you even exist. So in the early days, it was hilarious because I was marketing us. We had the dollars, but I was still trying to get in front of the nonprofits and pull lists from these different, community foundation and other places like that and say, hey, we're a new grant in town and we're trying to get our name out there. Please apply, which I think Meredith can attest to this too, had somewhat of a reverse effect eventually for us, because I think that worked a little too well. I mean, we had a lot of applicants come forward because we were trying to fit these gaps, which was really exciting. And so from that, I think we really did a good job getting our name out there. And then, of course, Meredith took over and made it a lot more of a systematic process, because in the beginning, we were fully doing this on Excel sheets and Google Forms and a lot of things that were not as clean and professional looking as they are today.
Can you talk a little bit about like the first grant committee and what you went through in terms of pulling those people together to support us in making this first decision?
I think what was interesting is in the beginning, none of us had any idea how involved grant reviewing was. I think we all are very business-minded individuals, but what we were very unprepared for, at least I won't speak for everyone, was just how different it is looking at things for nonprofits, looking at their mission statements, looking at their metrics that they follow, how they fund things. We were really going in blind. We had some great people who thankfully joined our grants process. Shout out to Amy Fair, who may be watching this, because without Amy Fair's expertise, who's from the Community Foundation, it was really hard knowing how to actually know who are successful nonprofits. How do we sift through this? How do we ultimately decide on who gets to move forward? So with Amy's help and her expertise, it helped us really guide through the process of who gets selected, why do they get selected, and then how do we ultimately coach other nonprofits? Because again, if you're thinking about how we were in this small and new space, one thing that we felt really passionate about was coming back to these nonprofits and giving them feedback on what exactly we talked about and why they didn't get selected and what they can do different, which I think actually did make a huge difference for some nonprofits that came back year over year and ultimately, eventually got funded by Impact Nashville. And, you know, I'd like to think some of it was correlated to the feedback that we provided, but that was some of the difference makers in that process. But yeah, it was a lot of figuring things out and outlining what was our criteria, again, like what are we looking for, why are we looking for it, and then how do we subsequently go from a large pot that's in a letter of intent stage, how do we move them into the grant process, what does that look like, what does that grant application even need to look like, what does that include, why are we including it, those kind of questions, and then ultimately going into those on-site visits. So how are we taking down this number from a large pot to a smaller pot so we can ultimately get it to that voting event? That was all very much figuring out a lot as we went, because we didn't know a lot in the beginning. And I'd like to think we've evolved so much.
I remember the second or third year when people on the grant committee said, wow, we had like 150 applications for the grant. And it was a lot for people to have to review, especially, you know, using a process like Excel spreadsheets. So, and we have always gotten really good feedback from our nonprofits that apply, that they say this helps them make them better, even helps them think about, you know, why do they exist? What is their purpose? What are they trying to do? And it brought their leadership teams together. So that's great. Meredith, we always have been very fortunate in the grant area as well, because one, it's been the largest membership committee. So we've got lots of members who join the grant committee. And then we've also pulled successors for the grant chair from there. So Meredith ran a committee, I believe, for at least 1 year, maybe more. And then came on the board as the grant chair. So Meredith, you want to talk a bit about your time as the director of the grants and some of the changes that you led for the organization?
When I stepped into the grants director role, we were growing at a tremendous pace. A lot of the work, the foundational work that Molly had done, just really sort of started snowballing, and we were getting a ton of letter of intent applications from nonprofits in the community. We had a lot of engagement from Impact100 Nashville members that wanted to serve on the committee. And I quickly realized that we needed to be able to scale a lot of our processes. And so during that time, one of the first things I identified was we needed a system to be able to collect applications and score them and keep a record of all of them. Molly alluded to spreadsheets. There were a lot of spreadsheets involved in the early days. And we have some pretty tech savvy people across the organization, but it just got to be too much when we were getting so many applications and having to keep track of it all. So we looked at a lot of different systems. We did an evaluation selection process, and we ended up going with Submittable as our tool because a lot of other chapters use it. And it's also something that nonprofits in the community are familiar with. I think they use it for other grant application processes. And so we implemented that, and it was pretty seamless. It enabled us to grow and scale and be able to handle more applications. It's enabled, I think, a higher level of engagement with our committee members. they're able to do things on their computer and pivot, score on their phone, start and stop seamlessly, and importantly provides us with that record of all of our past applications and scores, which really just makes us feel good from an organizational continuity standpoint. And so that's one of the first things that we did from a scalability standpoint. I think one of the other things that comes to mind is the grants director role. We split into two board positions while I was in that role. We created the nonprofit community liaison role on our board, and Joanne Sowell was the first member to fill that position. And I think that was a really good move for the organization because it allowed us to build deeper relationships with our past grant recipients and to be able to continue those relationships. Those winners of our grants are some of our strongest recruitment tools and some of our strongest proponents out in the community. They really get the word out about us and help us recruit both members and applicants. So that's another sort of scalability change that we made during that time.
It's very important to us to make sure that we're making good decisions for our members' money. And so the criteria on who can get the grant, and then the membership liaison also make sure that they're following through with what they said they were going to do with it as well.
Right.
And so I know you changed a lot of the process documents and the policy documents for the grants as well.
Worked with Joanne to do that and really just document all of the great processes that we had in place, and to think through different aspects of the grant making process. Let's see. One of the things that we had already been doing was, doing some level of reporting to ensure that our grant recipients were utilizing the funds as they had said that they were utilizing it. I think that we formalized that process a little bit. We created a midterm report and a final report. And we created templates for those reports so that they were uniform across all of our winners. And that had dual benefits. I think it provided the reporting that we needed to be able to demonstrate that our members' dollars were used in the way that we said they were going to be used. And it also allowed us to be able to track and measure things more meaningfully, having that look back to show quantitatively the impact of our dollars was really useful.
And Tiffany, you followed in Meredith's footsteps by being on the grant committee. You chaired a grant committee, and then became the director of the grant committee on the board. There are big changes happening. We are growing by leaps and bounds, new people on the board, founding board members were rolling off. So the continuity in what we were doing, and also growing as we were becoming part of the Impact Global Council, there was a lot of changes happening during that time. So can you speak to some of those?
One of the things that inevitably happened is we had more dollars to give away, right? Mm-hmm. So Molly talked a bit about when Impact Nashville started, our focus really was on small and new organizations that had really struggled getting funding. And one of the things that really initially changed under Meredith, and we continue to evolve and look at, was we now have over 100 members. The goal of Impact100 as a broader organization really is to give large, impactful grants. And so once we reached the point that we were giving away $100,000 plus, we had to rethink how we gave those dollars away, because $100,000 for an organization whose operating expenses were $25,000 is overwhelming. And so we changed criteria on how you qualified. And initially we continued to consider doing small and new grants with what we now lovingly call the tail funds, right? And so in 2021, which was the year that I led the full grants process, we had tail funds and made the decision to go ahead and do a small and new category. And one of the things that we realized, one, was making a post membership decision once the grants process started was created confusion among the grant committee. It made it harder to evaluate the different organizations. So going into 2023 and beyond, really said small and new doesn't fit the model of Impact 100 as well. And we also realized that it's super important to where we started. It's super important to our board members. We love giving small grants to organizations that don't get that funding otherwise. So Kristen and Beth Johnson, who are our current co-directors, really started looking towards how do we think about that differently, and how do we move and recognize the $100,000 grants while also thinking about the smaller organizations. One of the ways that we have done that, and that we will continue to do that, is to look at breaking points. So at some point, if we've got $5,000 in tail money, we can spread that out to the existing organizations. We also will start doing something they call Spark grants, where we're able to give money to small, innovative projects, whether it's with a large organization or a smaller organization. We can really stay true to that core founding principle of helping fund organizations and projects that may not have that opportunity.
They're all very good problems to have as we continue to grow as an organization, because we had the largest number of members this year with 230 members, and we want to get to over 500 members and give away 5 $100,000 grants, plus maybe some Spark grants along the way, depending on the number of members we have. Well, Molly, you talked about the first year, how we focused on small and new because we were small and new. And then the second and third year, we kept growing as an organization and we entered a new grant category. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
We also saw some players come to the table, some nonprofits who were applying that we were really excited about as well, that maybe didn't perfectly fit into our small and new category. And also we as board members were familiar with nonprofits and categories of nonprofits that weren't also falling into that small and new category. So going back to our original intent of what is the purpose of Impact Nashville and what is the purpose of our grants, we wanted to, again, find those places that weren't being funded. And what we got really passionate about and what we created ultimately was this all-encompassing category called Ending the Cycle. Because what we liked about it was this was a grant category that wasn't just addressing a symptom of an issue of some societal or cultural or whatever that may be issue. This was really trying to address what is the root cause of what is happening and who is actually trying to address that to ultimately get people or systems or issues out of the cycle that they're in and actually address the root issues. So we created what we called Ending the Cycle as a category to really hopefully grab some of those nonprofits that were thinking more at that systemic issue and not just addressing that symptom. And that really brought forth a lot of very interesting nonprofits. That one was really interesting to score. I remember having so many conversations in those grant review meetings of, okay, but are they actually ending the cycle? Are they actually addressing what is the root issue here? And that is a really hard thing sometimes to tease apart. I mean, it got into some really interesting discussions and debates among us women in the grant review committees. And I love, really getting into that because it really charged us with thinking critically about what are we trying to do with this grant and what are we ultimately hoping to see in those final few that end up being in our voting committee and what are they addressing.
Meredith, Molly talked a bit about the grant categories, and I know we became part of the Global Impact Council while you were the grant director. Can you talk a bit about their categories and how we align with the global organization?
The global organization utilizes 5 categories that all of their grants fall within. There are really broad concepts like education and environment, our grant categories were created with this local mentality focused on addressing the needs of our city, addressing the needs of our community. And when we created them and we looked at the Impact 100 categories utilized across the country, we realized that our grant categories really ladder up to those bigger concepts. And so we utilize those for reporting purposes. And we feel that our categories address local needs and sort of roll up to those broader categories utilized by other chapters.
The other thing we talked about in a previous episode was about the benefits of us aligning to the global organization, the Global Impact Organization. Can you talk about the National Day of Giving and what that has done for us?
That has been a really exciting development, and it didn't shift our calendar too much. We were already ending our grant cycle towards the end of the year in November, and there was an initiative to align all Impact 100 chapters across the country to award their grants on the same day. And we ended up contributing to that process. We aligned on a day that was very close to what we were already doing. And what it's done is really amplified our impact. I think it has allowed us to talk about giving away grants in the Nashville community alongside all of our partner chapters across the country that are doing the same things in their community. And it's just sort of made our impact feel part of something even bigger.
I want to thank you to our panelists and thank you to those who are watching. It has been a pleasure talking about the early days of our organization and how far we've come and the impact we've had on our community. We'd love for you to become a member.